It was a cold December morning in 1945, just a few months after the end of World War II. If you want to hear more moving stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what time you're watching. Your participation means a lot to us. The streets of Hiroshima still bore the deep scars of those dark days, and amidst the rubble, people tried to rebuild their lives with a quiet determination that only those who have lost everything can understand. American soldier Thomas Mitchell walked the devastated streets as part of his patrols. At 23, he had been deployed to Japan as part of the occupying forces, but unlike many of his comrades, Thomas carried in his heart a special sensitivity to human suffering. He had grown up on a small farm in Kentucky, where his mother always taught him that kindness knows no boundaries of nationality or language. On that particular day, as Thomas walked through an area particularly affected by the devastation, he heard a sound that made his heart skip a beat. It was the faint cry of a child coming from a partially destroyed house. He approached cautiously and saw a scene that would remain etched in his memory forever. A Japanese family, an elderly man, a middle-aged woman who appeared to be his daughter, and 3 small children were gathered around a makeshift fire, trying to keep warm with pieces of wet wood that produced more smoke than heat. The elderly man, noticing the American soldiers' presence, slowly stood up. His eyes reflected not the fear Thomas expected to find, but something much deeper, desperation mixed with a last glimmer of hope. With trembling gestures and words in Japanese, Thomas didn't understand. The elderly man began pointing at the children and then at his own mouth, making the universal gesture of hunger. Thomas didn't need to understand Japanese to understand what was happening. The family was starving, and the harsh winter made the situation even more dire. The children, with their torn clothes and pale faces, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and hope that broke his heart. In that moment, Thomas had to make a decision that would define not only the fate of that family, but also his own understanding of humanity and compassion. The orders were clear. Keep his distance from Japanese civilians, report any suspicious situations, and follow protocol. But looking at those starving children, all the orders in the world seemed insignificant compared to the basic human need that lay before him. Without hesitation, Thomas opened his backpack and pulled out his military rations. They were just a few cans of preserves and dry biscuits, but for that family, they represented the difference between life and death. With gentle gestures, he approached the children and began distributing the food. The elderly man's face completely transformed. The tears that began to well up in his eyes were not of sadness, but of gratitude so profound it transcended any cultural or linguistic barrier. The woman, who had remained silent until then, approached Thomas and, her hands trembling with emotion, bowed deeply. She repeated words in Japanese that he didn't understand, but the tone of her voice made it clear they were words of sincere gratitude. The children, initially shy, began to approach him with growing curiosity. But Thomas knew that one-time help wouldn't be enough. This family needed ongoing assistance, and he couldn't be there every day to help them. It was then that he had an idea that would change everything. He decided he would return the next day, not just with more food, but with a plan to help this family more permanently. That night, back at the barracks, Thomas couldn't sleep. Images of those starving children haunted his thoughts, and he knew he needed to do something more meaningful. He decided to talk to some of his fellow soldiers, men who, like him, had grown up in homes where kindness and solidarity were core values. The first to join him was Private David Rodriguez, a young Texas man whose parents had immigrated from Mexico and who knew all too well the hardships of life. David had noticed Thomas's concern, and when he learned of the situation, he didn't hesitate to offer his help. "If there are children going hungry, we have to do something," he said with the simplicity of someone who understands that some things in life are simply right or wrong, with no middle ground. Soon other soldiers joined the cause. Private Robert Johnson, an African-American from South Carolina, who had experienced discrimination in his own homeland, understood better than anyone the importance of reaching out to those most in need. "Kindness is kindness, no matter the color of your skin or your country of origin," he said when Thomas explained the situation. Irish soldier Patrick O'Connor whose grandparents had fled the famine in Ireland decades earlier, felt a personal connection to the Japanese family's suffering. My grandmother used to tell me stories about how strangers helped them when they arrived in America hungry and hopeless. Now it's our turn to be those kind strangers for someone else, he said, tears welling in his eyes. The next day, Thomas returned to the destroyed house, but this time he wasn't alone. 4 American soldiers walked together through the streets of Hiroshima, carrying not only food but also blankets, warm clothing, and materials for basic repairs to the damaged house. The Japanese family's reaction was even more moving than Thomas had anticipated. The elderly man, seeing a group of American soldiers approaching his home with arms laden with supplies, fell to his knees and began to weep openly. His tears were a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something deeper, the realization that humanity and kindness still existed in the world, even after years of war and suffering. The woman, whom Thomas later discovered was named Akiko, approached him and, through gestures, tried to explain that she was a widow and that the elderly man was her father. Her husband had died during the war, and she was trying to care for her 3 children and her ailing father alone. The situation was desperate, but now, for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. The children, initially frightened by the presence of so many foreign soldiers, soon began to show their natural childhood curiosity. The youngest, a girl of about 5 named Yuki, timidly approached David Rodriguez and gently touched the badge on his uniform. David smiled and, removing the badge, carefully placed it in the child's small hand, making her smile for the first time. The American soldiers spent the entire day working on the family's home. Patrick O'Connor, who had worked in construction before enlisting, led the effort to repair the damaged roof. Robert Johnson used his carpentry skills to repair broken windows and reinforce weakened structures. David Rodriguez organized the food supplies and created a storage system that would protect the food from moisture and rodents. Thomas, meanwhile, tried to establish more effective communication with his family. Through gestures, drawings on the floor, and the few English words Akiko knew, they began to develop a rudimentary but effective communication system. This is how Thomas learned that the elderly man's name was Hiroshi, and that he had been a teacher before the war. Hiroshi, despite his frail condition, insisted on helping where he could. He showed the soldiers where to find usable building materials among the rubble and shared valuable local knowledge about how to make their homes more resilient to the approaching cold winter. His dignity and determination to contribute, even in his vulnerable condition, deeply impressed the American soldiers. As the days passed, that small humanitarian aid project began to grow organically. The other soldiers, seeing the positive impact of their comrades' work, began volunteering. Captain James Morrison, initially concerned about potential protocol violations, decided to unofficially support the project after visiting the family and seeing firsthand the difference it was making. "Soldiers," he said at an informal meeting, "you are demonstrating the best of the American spirit. You are showing the world that we are a nation that cares about human suffering, regardless of nationality or past circumstances. Keep up this work, but do it with wisdom and respect." News of the project spread beyond the American barracks. Soldiers from other units began bringing donations: food, clothing, building materials, and even medicine. A military doctor, Dr. William Hayes, offered his services to examine Hiroshi, who had developed a persistent cough that worried his family. Dr. Hayes discovered that Hiroshi was suffering from severe malnutrition and a respiratory infection that, if left untreated, could be fatal. He immediately initiated treatment and provided appropriate nutritional supplements. "This man needs regular medical care," he explained to Thomas. "I will see that he receives the necessary treatment." Meanwhile, the transformation in the Japanese family was remarkable. The children, previously silent and apathetic, began to display the natural energy and curiosity of childhood. Yuki, the youngest girl, developed a special affection for David Rodriguez, always running to greet him when he arrived. The middle boy, Kenji, about 8 years old, showed a special interest in construction tools and began helping Patrick O'Connor with repairs. The eldest son, 12-year-old Takeshi, was more reserved, but Thomas noticed that he closely observed everything the soldiers did. One day, Takeshi approached Thomas with a piece of paper on which he had drawn their house before it was destroyed. Through gestures and expressions, he conveyed his gratitude and his dream of seeing the house restored to its former glory. Akiko, the mother, began to demonstrate renewed strength and determination. She actively helped with the repairs, displaying astonishing sewing and organizational skills. When soldiers brought damaged fabrics, she transformed them into usable curtains and blankets. Her gratitude was evident not only in her words, but in every action, every smile, every gesture of hospitality she offered her American benefactors. One of the most touching scenes occurred 3 weeks after their first meeting. Hiroshi, who had made a significant recovery thanks to medical care, approached Thomas carrying an object carefully wrapped in cloth. It was a book of Japanese poetry that had belonged to his family for generations. Through gestures, he conveyed that he wanted to give the book to Thomas as a token of gratitude. Thomas was deeply moved, but initially hesitant to accept something so obviously precious to the family. Hiroshi, however, insisted, and through Akiko, who had learned a few words of English, he was able to convey the message. This book represents our family, our history, our soul. We want you to have it so you never forget that kindness builds family, even among strangers. This moment marked an emotional turning point for everyone involved. Thomas realized he had received far more than he had given. The experience was changing his perspective on humanity, war, forgiveness, and the ability of people from different cultures to connect through compassion. But the story was far from over. News of the project began to attract the attention of other military units in the region. Soon, American soldiers stationed elsewhere in Japan began replicating similar initiatives. What had begun as an isolated act of kindness was transforming into a spontaneous movement of humanitarian assistance. Colonel William Patterson, regional commander of U.S. forces, decided to personally visit the project to understand what was happening. He arrived expecting to find a protocol violation that would need to be addressed. But what he found was something completely different. Upon arriving at the Japanese family's home, Colonel Patterson saw a scene that left him speechless. American soldiers and Japanese civilians working side by side, children playing happily, and an atmosphere of cooperation and mutual respect he had never witnessed in his long military career. Hiroshi, despite his frailty, made a point of personally welcoming the high-ranking officer. Through Akiko, who could now communicate in basic English, he expressed his gratitude not only for the individual soldiers, but for America as a nation that had raised men capable of such kindness. Colonel Patterson, a veteran hardened by decades of military service, found himself fighting back tears as he watched the scene. "Private Mitchell," he said after a few moments, "what you and your men have done here represents the best of our nation. You have shown that true strength lies not only in the ability to win wars, but in the ability to build bridges after them." From that day on, the project received official support. More resources were allocated, more soldiers volunteered, and what had begun as aid for one family expanded to support dozens of families in the region. But the heart of the project always remained the same: the fundamental belief that kindness begets kindness, and that shared humanity transcends all political or cultural differences. Months passed, and the transformation was extraordinary. Akiko's family home was completely restored, becoming one of the most beautiful in the neighborhood. Hiroshi, now restored to health, had resumed his role as a teacher, offering informal classes to children in the community. Akiko had started a small sewing business, using skills she had honed during the reconstruction of her home. The children blossomed in ways no one could have predicted. Yuki, once shy and malnourished, had become a lively and curious child who spoke basic English and served as a bridge between American soldiers and other Japanese families. Kenji had developed impressive construction skills and frequently helped other soldiers with similar projects. Takeshi, the eldest, had become a sort of youth ambassador, helping organize relief efforts for other families in need. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred within the American soldiers themselves. Thomas Mitchell, who had started it all, discovered a calling for humanitarian work that would define the rest of his life. David Rodriguez developed a deep interest in Japanese culture and decided to study the language formally. Patrick O'Connor discovered a talent for sustainable construction and began developing reconstruction techniques that were both efficient and environmentally responsible. Robert Johnson found in the experience a validation of his values of equality and social justice that would inspire his future activism. The story reached the ears of American and Japanese journalists. When the first reports were published, the reaction was overwhelming. Letters of support poured in from around the world. Donations poured in from American communities, and other military personnel began to follow suit in different parts of the world where American forces were stationed. One of the most touching letters came from Mary Mitchell, Thomas's mother, in Kentucky. She wrote, "My son, when you were little, I always told you that the true measure of a man is not what he can achieve for himself, but what he can give to others. Reading about your actions in Japan filled me with pride in a way your military medals never could. You not only honored our country, but you honored humanity." Hiroshi, whose English had improved dramatically during the months of interacting with the soldiers, wrote a letter that was published in Japanese and American newspapers. In it, he said, "War taught us the worst of humanity. These American soldiers taught us the best. They didn't see defeated enemies when they looked at us. They saw a family in need." This difference in perspective is what separates barbarity from civilization, hatred from love, despair from hope. Hiroshi's letter touched hearts on both sides of the Pacific and became a symbol of the potential for reconciliation and mutual understanding, even after devastating conflicts. A year after the first meeting, a special ceremony was organized. Representatives from the Japanese and American governments were present to officially recognize the project and its impact on rebuilding relations between the two nations. But for those who had lived through the experience firsthand, the true ceremony took place every day. In every gesture of kindness, every shared smile, every cultural barrier overcome, Thomas Mitchell, now promoted to sergeant, was awarded for exceptional humanitarian service. In his acceptance speech, he said, "This medal does not belong to me. It belongs to every soldier who chose to see humanity where others saw difference. It belongs to the Japanese family that taught us that gratitude is a universal language. It belongs to all who believe that kindness has no nationality." Akiko, who had learned enough English to communicate fluently, responded on behalf of her family. "You saved us from starvation, but more importantly, you saved us from despair. You showed us that there are still angels in this world and that they sometimes wear American uniforms." The story spread far beyond Japan's borders. It became a symbol of how individuals can make a difference, how compassion can overcome historical prejudices, and how a nation's true strength lies in its citizens' ability to reach out to those in need. Years later, when Thomas Mitchell returned to the United States, he carried with him not only memories, but also a lifelong mission. He founded a non-governmental organization dedicated to helping refugees and displaced people, directly inspired by his experience in Japan. David Rodriguez became a professor of Japanese and Asian history, dedicating his career to promoting cultural understanding. Patrick O'Connor developed sustainable construction techniques that were used in reconstruction projects around the world. Robert Johnson became a civil rights leader, often citing his experience in Japan as an example of how prejudice can be overcome through compassionate action. The Japanese family also prospered in extraordinary ways. Yuki grew up to become a translator and diplomat, serving as a bridge between different cultures. Kenji became a civil engineer, specializing in post-disaster reconstruction. Takeshi followed in his grandfather's footsteps as an educator, but with a special focus on international cultural exchange programs. Hiroshi lived to be 89, long enough to see his grandchildren grow up in a world where friendship between Japan and the United States had become one of the pillars of international stability. Before he died, he wrote his memoirs, dedicating an entire chapter to those angel soldiers who had transformed his family's despair into hope. Akiko became a respected community leader, organizing assistance programs for struggling families and promoting cultural exchanges. She corresponded with Thomas Mitchell until the end of her life, and her letters became valuable historical documents on the transformation of Japanese-American relations in the post-war period. The house rebuilt by American soldiers still stands today, transformed into a small museum dedicated to international friendship and the importance of individual kindness in times of global crisis. Visitors from around the world come to see the place where a desperate family found salvation through the compassion of strangers who became family. Photographs from those early days, showing American soldiers and Japanese civilians working side by side, became some of the most powerful images of the 20th century, symbolizing the human capacity to overcome divisions through love and mutual understanding. The story of Thomas Mitchell and Akiko's family teaches us that the most significant moments in history don't always happen on grand political stages or famous battlefields. Sometimes they happen in destroyed homes, in the tears of gratitude of a starving child, in the smile of an elderly person regaining faith in humanity, in the simple decision to reach out to someone in need. This is a story about how individual kindness can create ripples of change that spread far beyond their point of origin. It's about how a nation's true strength lies not only in its military or economic prowess, but in the compassion of its citizens. It's about how love can overcome hate, how hope can conquer despair, and how strangers can become family through the universal language of kindness. Most importantly, it's a story that reminds us that each of us has the power to make a difference. We don't need to be soldiers, diplomats, or world leaders. We just need the courage to see the humanity in others and the determination to act on that vision. Thomas Mitchell often said in his later lectures, "That day in Hiroshima, I thought I was saving a Japanese family from starvation. Only later did I realize they had saved me from something far worse, the belief that differences between people are greater than our shared humanity." The story of a Japanese family who begged an American soldier for help and received far more than they could have imagined continues to inspire people around the world. It reminds us that in our darkest moments, the light of human compassion can shine brightest, illuminating the path to a better future for all. This is a story about hope, about second chances, about the beauty that can emerge from the ashes of destruction when people of goodwill decide to build bridges instead of walls. It's a story that belongs to all of us, because we all have the capacity to be the compassionate soldier or the grateful family, to be the one who extends a hand or the one who gratefully receives it. And perhaps this is the most important lesson of all, that true victory lies not in defeating enemies, but in turning enemies into friends, in replacing despair with hope, in choosing love where others have chosen hate. This is the story of how this is possible, one act of kindness at a time. Thomas Mitchell lived to be 87, always carrying in his heart the gratitude of that Japanese family and the certainty that the Lord God had used his hands to perform a miracle of love and compassion. He often said that on that day in Hiroshima, it wasn't just his actions that made the difference, but divine providence that placed him in the right place at the right time, with a heart open to serve. This story teaches us that when we open our hearts to help others, the Lord God multiplies our small gestures into unimaginable blessings, creating waves of love that cross oceans and generations.